Hello, and welcome to Religion and Life. I'm your host, Ozzie. During the past year, national discussions about ethnicity, race, inclusivity, and diversity have intensified due to events that have renewed our determination to fight racism and inequalities that affect underrepresented groups in our society. While much of the discussion around these issues have come from socioeconomic or political viewpoints, my guest today, Dr. Brian Rainey, brings a fresh perspective from his work on the Hebrew Bible. Welcome, Dr. Rainey. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So you're at Princeton Theological Seminary, and you're also teaching courses for us at Appalachian State University. So it's been nice to have you with us, and you're doing great work for us. And I'm very interested in the work you're doing with the Hebrew Bible, and I wondered if you could just take a moment to talk about your work with issues surrounding ethnicity in the Hebrew Bible and in the ancient Near East.
Yeah, I could talk a little bit about it. Ethnicity is one of those terms that we use a lot, and I'm not sure people always reflect on what it means. I think that there's been more intentionality around that lately, but it still, I think, is a word that's thrown around a lot, along with race, actually. And I'm not sure people think about what that actually means and how it plays out in the way that we talk about it. I'm not necessarily talking about it as a sociological phenomenon, which, of course it is. But if you would ask someone what they mean by race, what is race? I'm not sure that, or ethnicity. I think you might get a lot of different kinds of answers.
Right.
But people who study the ancient world, and I think people who study history in general, also use this terminology sometimes. And it's only recently that people have started to really reflect on what they mean by that term. And so I'm just joining that discussion. But I do think that we have to account for why we use this word so frequently and commonly, and not say another word to describe the kinds of people groupings that we find in ancient texts. And that probably goes for medieval texts. It goes for texts in other cultures that didn't develop a concept of ethnicity, maybe the same way that people did in the Western Europe and in North America did. But people like to use the term, and I wanted to ask, what do we mean when we're using that term, especially when we're applying this to ancient texts like the Hebrew Bible? And not to mention, I mean, this goes without saying, but, well, it doesn't go without saying. The Bible is a text that's not just an ancient artifact. I mean, it's interesting in that way in its own right. I mean, it can be studied that way, but it's important to current communities of faith. So I think it's also important that we talk more about what we mean by ethnicity in those texts for that reason as well.
Yeah, so it is important because so many contemporary communities of faith go to the Bible in order to direct their own ethical and moral standards in a world that is contextually very different from the ancient world. So what I'm hearing you say is that oftentimes we take our own understandings and misunderstandings of these terms as they're used in a contemporary setting, and then place them on top of text that are in a completely different contextual space, and that might create then misunderstandings about what's going on in the text or in the ancient world. Is that a fair paraphrase?
Yes, and it may obfuscate even what's going on in the text, and it may direct people's attention to things in the text that are not necessarily there, or at the expense of other things in the text. That's one thing that it can do. However, I'd say that scholars sometimes go in the other direction and say we can't define ethnicity at all, and it's so socially constructed that that there's no real reason to define it. At the same time, people are still using the term, so it sort of people use the term but are hesitant to define what it is, yet are still using it.
Right. Let me ask you this: in terms of the Hebrew Bible, is there even if our concepts of race and ethnicity are socially determined, is there a social construction of race in the Hebrew Bible, or do we need to change our language when we talk about the sort of interactions we see between the ancient Israelites and other people?
Yeah, I think that I have a particular lens that I bring to the text, but I think different people may have different lenses. First, I think we need to be very critical of the terminology we use. So that's what we're talking about right now. But I think we also need to talk about what race is. And in my view, there really isn't a concept of race in the Hebrew Bible or the ancient world in general.
Hmm.
It's been used for certain people group constructions in, say, the Hebrew Bible or Mesopotamian text or even a Greco-Roman text. But race, as we understand it, as a sort of taxonomy of people based on physical features, if we're defining it that way, that's not so much an issue in the ancient world. And I think that's a little different from texts noticing skin colors, because ancient texts will notice that, say, certain skin colors cluster with certain groups of people. That's very true. That does happen. But what has ended up happening until fairly recently, and I say recently is the last 40 years or so in ancient studies, is that people were reading modern concepts of race into that noticing of skin color, when that's not what it was. That was part of noticing, say, Ethiopian skin color was part of a cluster of interesting things that people would note about Nubians. It was not, we're creating a category of races based on different skin colors.
Mhm. Is that being the case? And I think that's a really important differentiation to make between modern conceptualizations of race and what we see going on with interactions of ancient peoples in the Hebrew Bible. With that being said, are there more helpful terms that we could employ for understanding the way people perceived cultural differences or other differences that are pointed out to us in the ancient text?
Yeah, so I use the term ethnicity.
Okay.
However, I always want students to take a critical sort of stance towards everybody's views, even my own. And so sometimes as a placeholder, I will say people groups in the ancient text. Um, and that's because I think we can all agree that whatever we call this, they are conceptualizing these different peoples as groups. And we can talk about groups from a sort of social, psychological, and even a cognitive perspective. We can talk about categorization and how the mind categorizes people.
Mhm.
So if you don't like ethnicity, there is other vocabulary you can use. I think it's important to use ethnicity for a couple of reasons. Ancient scholars are operating in a modern world. So, and all historians are operating both in the world that they live in and the world in which they're studying. And maybe that's true for all humanities subjects that are studying something that is different. We in the humanities, as you know, we call this the problem of the other. A lot of philosophical issues there, but and so we can, if you want to use a placeholding term, people groups is what I use. Ethnicity is a part of our modern sort of conversations. And my argument has been that we can use an idiosyncratic sort of scholarly technical term for what's going on in the text, but modern readers will come to the text, say we're teaching students or we're encountering or we're talking about it in a church or a synagogue setting. uh, they will come with this idiom of ethnicity ready to go. And so, what is a scholar going to do with that? And so what I do is say ethnicity is the fine sort of term and analytical concept through which to view these different people groups. Because I think what they're doing does have some resonance with the way that we categorize people into different groups as well. And so that's kind of why I use the term ethnicity. But again, you know, some people argue that ethnicity even isn't an appropriate term to use for ancient texts, that it's too modern, that it's too implicated in Western, put that so you can see it, Western notions of Western concepts, so that that even isn't an appropriate term. Yet, I mean, it's hard to come up with a replacement
Right.
that has a similar kind of resonance with the kinds of group formations that we're working with today.
Yeah. Yeah. So if we bring, well, let me first ask you, you mentioned categorization of people into people groups or into ethnic categories. Is it possible, and you also use the word the other or otherness, is it possible to categorize without bringing value judgments to the categorization, without creating hierarchical taxonomies? And is that something that we bring from our own kind of modern perspective as well, or were the same sorts of categorizations with value judgments attached going on in the ancient world? Or is that even a valid question for these ancient
I
concepts?
think it's a very valid question. It's a very valid question. In fact, it's one that people make to distinguish between ethnicity and race. Some people argue that ethnicity is more neutral and that race is a hierarchical form of that. And is it possible to make categories without hierarchy? You know, I think it'll depend on who you talk to. If you were to talk to, say, structuralists, and they might say there's always going to be a binary and there's always going to be one part of the binary, the other that's not favored, and one that is favored. But others say that maybe in theory, you can do that. The thing about categorization, though, is that it's I don't want to say design because it's an intentionality that I don't want to input, but it's designed, for lack of a better word, to help people navigate their environment and specifically their social world. And so that categorization is going to reflect their social world. And typically our societies are hierarchical. And so categorization, at least at this point, may come with that problem. And whether we can fix that to make it more non-hierarchical or not hierarchical is something I think we need to think more about. But I will say that a lot of the cognitive science literature is not critical about that.
Yeah. Well, let me take the discussion in a slightly different direction. So we do have a lot of people reading the Bible in today's world. We have scholars who are approaching the Bible from a literary perspective. We have theologians, we have clerics, and we have lay people. And we're all kind of bringing our modern proclivities to the discussion. And oftentimes the Bible has been used or misused to support attitudes towards enslavement, to support attitudes towards I guess the 20th century concept of genocide or ethnic cleansing. So what do we do when we encounter in these ancient texts attitudes that by today's standards would be considered racist or xenophobic or homophobic? And how do we navigate trying to conceptualize and contextualize those passages way that we can get beyond some of the language and the misconceptions of what's going on?
Yeah, that's another very difficult one. And the fact of the matter is that people are going to be reading these texts religiously and theologically. And I think biblical scholars need, even those who take a highly, highly secular approach to the study of the Hebrew Bible or New Testament, I think they need to be cognizant of the fact that what they say will make it into churches. And if you say something wrong, it's going to be circulating in churches 30 years after it's been corrected. So be aware of that, and be as careful as you can, in good faith, about what you're saying about these texts. There are the Hebrew Bible was written in an ancient West Asian society, and it reflects a lot of the values of that part of the world at that time. And some of the things that we find in the text are absolutely incompatible with values that we hold today. There is genocide, and then there's a debate over whether or not to use the word genocide, but there's what we would recognize as genocide, and certainly people have used the texts, that they've taken as authoritative to support genocidal programs. And they've been used to support the enslavement of peoples that were deemed inferior, sinful, pagan, and so on and so forth. So that's the reality. And how do we deal with those texts? One thing, I don't see how you can get around saying that this is wrong. I think that it's people may be hesitant to say, but it is wrong. It is not compatible. And then, some people develop reading strategies to deal with that. Some just say that some people ignore it. That's a very common mainline Christian approach, is to just ignore it, or say, God didn't say that, or what have you. Others justify it, which I think leads to some pretty disturbing places. I personally don't believe that the Bible causes atrocities. It's an ancient West Asian text. Why would you even think that it applies to anything that you're doing now without very, very careful reinterpretation and reexamination? But people do. And the very practice of justifying something, even if it's fictional, even if it's not necessarily reflective of a historical situation, that very exercise, I think, is toxic. Of even going through the motions of saying this was okay then because those people were, bad people who had it coming. And others do a more allegorical kind of interpretation, which I think is fairly popular in more conservative Christian circles, because many of them even are hesitant to confirm what's going on in the text. So it's a sort of allegorical kind of reading that the people who are slaughtered represent sin, or something like that, which is better than just justifying it outright.
Yeah, I was interested in an article that you shared with me that you have, I guess it's a chapter in a book that will be forthcoming. But in that chapter, in that article, you talked about the ways, some of the ways in the ancient biblical text, the Hebrew text, these texts, I guess, categorize people groups. And in dealing with ethics, you talk about there being a kind of standard of empathy in some places that is offered toward how to interact with either the concept of foreignness or alien residents, I think is a phrase you use. And also a concept of justice, where these texts will provide for certain protections for certain disenfranchised groups. So that to me seems to be set up a kind of counter narrative to what's going on in some of these texts, where there seems to be conflict between different people groups. Could you comment a little bit on that? I guess it's more of an ethical question, perhaps, than anything.
It is an ethical question. I approach this as someone who just studies sort of concepts of justice and ethics in the ancient world generally. I actually think the ancient world, not too much unlike the modern world, struggled with what I would like to consider is an intuitive concept of justice, and the way that they ran things, basically. Absolute monarchy, conquest and imperialism, the expansion of ancient states, which was basically legalized banditry. You just conquered people for slaves and tribute and all this other stuff. The way they ran things was one thing, but I think they still struggled with intuitive concepts of justice that came through. And that's my own theory, that's my own perspective. And you will see, because I believe empathy is a intuitive human emotion, and I think in the book chapter I mentioned that, and should be central to how we understand ethics, that there is empathy attested in the Hebrew Bible. There is empathy for at least certain kinds of foreigners expressed in the Hebrew Bible. I will go so far as to say even that this focus on the foreigner, and we can come up with reasons why it may be unique to ancient Israel's history, but regardless of the reason, there is a particular focus on at least being empathetic towards a kind of foreigner in the Hebrew Bible that's not really focused in, say, Mesopotamian texts. It's not that they were okay with mistreating strangers or outsiders, or that there wasn't a concept of hospitality, but just as far as explicitly developing a kind of rhetoric around this, the Hebrew Bible seems to be seems to stand out in that respect.
Well, I think here's probably the most important question I want to ask you in light of what this show examines, and that's how religion actually functions in society. What sort of advice or guidance could you give in answering the question such as this? How can given the great contextual divide, in what ways can these ancient texts be instructive to us in our contemporary situation as we deal with issues like anti-racism and inclusivity and othering in our society? Are these texts helpful, or are they not? And what must we do if we're going to use them in a productive, positive way?
Yes, so I think they can be useful. I'm going to talk about it from, first of all, maybe a secular perspective and then a more theological one. From a secular perspective, I think you can look at how peoples in the past struggled with how to conceptualize people groups and how to get along with peoples that they perceived as outsiders. Maybe how they got it wrong. And as a segue into a more theological conversation, how these writers struggled with an empathy that I think is intuitive, right? But also, as I said, struggling with the way that their society was set up and the historical circumstances in which they found themselves. And so, just as a segue, we too have a similar kind of situation. We have professed values, and we have a social structure that is not reflecting those professed values. And so, in being able to look at the Hebrew Bible, or maybe even the New Testament, and other religious texts, we can sort of look at how they struggled with it and perhaps take lessons from that, both in what maybe to do and particularly what not to do. And I think that's one of the lessons that sometimes people in the hierarchy of churches, at least, don't want to say, that maybe this is a case in which our writers and our spiritual forebearers got it wrong. And I think we need to contextualize that wrongness. They lived in a different time and had different social pressures. It's not an excuse, it's just more of a contextualizing where they were. And also using that sort of as a mirror to critique what we are currently doing at the moment.
Yeah. So is this when we recognize, maybe this is one of the roles of religion, right? One of the functions of religion. Maybe it's the prophetic function of religion to point out when a society's values are out of line, or maybe a society's social structures don't support the society's values, and to bring that to awareness and to provide prescriptions for that. Is that one of the things religion does in our culture and in our society?
Yes, and I think it's a great source of, again, speaking fairly secularly here, it's a great source of myth, I think. And these ancient myths, which are not our own, can be invoked as counter myths to current social myths that may be going on. And so the rhetoric of the text, the prophetic rhetoric, and so on, can be brought into tension with current social myths that are happening. There's no formula, right? There's no, the Bible says this, therefore we'll be able to, we'll be able to implement this program, or the Bible supports this particular social program. That's not, I think, how it's going to work. And that's how you get this sort of proof texting battles and ping pong we get between different Christians about politics. I think it more serves as a source for exercising, I guess, our ethical imagination and thinking about going beyond the paradigms that we may be unaware of or trapped in that are keeping people oppressed or marginalized.
Right. And unfortunately, religion doesn't always help us to deconstruct those paradigms. Unfortunately, sometimes religion seems to bolster them and support them.
That's the other unfortunate side of the coin. And that's sort of the dark side of it, or the negative side of it, which is that because these texts were written in highly authoritarian and hierarchical societies, people who are interested in authoritarianism and hierarchy can grab onto those things and use them to support their programs of marginalization and their visions of marginalization and hierarchy. So yes, that's very much a part of it. At the same time, I would say social and secular myths, have a similar kind of drawback and blowback effect. They are often implicated in problematic, at the very least, and even authoritarian kinds of roots or elements that, if we're not critical about them, they too can reinforce some marginalization and visions of hierarchy.
Absolutely. Well, Brian, this has been fascinating. I'm really intrigued by your work, and I look forward to getting to know you better and getting to know your work better. And I thank you today for joining us and talking to us about these very important social and religious dynamics. So
thank you for the invitation.
Yeah. Well, that's it for Religion and Life for this week. We hope you'll join us here on AppTV next time as we continue to explore the world of religion and how it affects our society and culture. Until then, this is Ozzie Ostwald.